The most stable systems of power in history did not collapse when they ran out of money, gold, or loyal armies. They collapsed when the state crossed an invisible but tangible line, when it began to control that without which a human being physically cannot exist. And most often, it wasn't bread, not water, and not land. It was salt. It sounds strange. To a modern person, salt is something unnoticeable, mundane, fine white dust in a shaker on the table that costs pennies. We don't even think about it until it runs out. But if you removed it from the world for a few weeks, absolute chaos would ensue. It's not about taste, it's about biology and survival. The human body cannot retain water or transmit nerve impulses without sodium. But what was even more important, in antiquity, it was impossible to preserve food without salt. Meat rotted, fish spoiled, vegetables turned to dust. Without salt, there were no winter reserves. Without reserves, cities could not grow. Without cities, there was no civilization. And of course, without food supplies, no army in the world could march further than a 3-day journey from its fields. This meant that without salt, there was no power, no expansion, no stability. And that is exactly why rulers across all eras again and again chose salt as the perfect, flawless instrument of absolute control. We are used to thinking that empires are held together by brute force, by legions, cannons, battering rams, fleets, and brilliant generals. But behind this beautiful facade described in textbooks, there was always the cold math of economics. And at the core of any economy are basic resources. Those resources that a person cannot give up, even if they want to, even if they are starving. And salt fit this role perfectly. Some of the first to realize this frightening mechanic of power were the Chinese. As far back as the 7th century BC, during the spring and autumn period, an advisor to the ruler of the Qi state proposed a brilliant idea. Do not impose direct taxes that anger the peasants. Simply tax salt and iron. But this system reached a truly imperial scale later, under the mighty Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, around 119 BC. That was when a strict state monopoly was introduced. It wasn't just an economic decision, it was a superpower's survival strategy. Emperor Wu fought endless, exhausting wars against the northern Xiongnu nomadic tribes. His armies required colossal funds for horses, armor, and provisions. The treasury was emptying before his eyes. And instead of sending tax collectors to every village and provoking riots, the state took control of what people were going to buy every single day anyway. Private salt works were closed. Traditions of extraction were destroyed. All production, every pinch of salt, was now controlled by an army of bureaucrats. The price skyrocketed. Treasury revenues grew even faster, exceeding all of the emperor's expectations. And here enters the key detail of this scheme. The tax became invisible. People did not hand their coins to a tax collector, looking him in the eye. They simply overpaid the merchant for salt at the market. Their anger was directed at the prices, not the emperor. It worked amazingly well. Resistance in such a system arises much later because the cause of poverty is hidden behind the everyday routine. But it still arises. Even during the Han era, underground salt works appeared. Smuggling emerged. Entire shadow networks of illegal trade formed, protected by armed gangs. The state responded with extreme harshness, total confiscations, branding, brutal punishments, mass executions. But it was impossible to stop this process completely. Because you can control the market with legions of officials, but you cannot control the needs of the human body. Centuries passed, continents changed, and the exact same logic blossomed in Rome. The Roman Republic, and later the Great Empire, roughly from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. Here, salt became not just a commodity, but a strategic military resource. Roman legions were constantly on the move. They marched from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germany. They had to feed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They had to preserve meat, fish, and grain. Without massive amounts of salt, Rome's logistics would have collapsed in a month. The famous road appeared, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, one of the oldest trade routes on the peninsula. It connected the salt pans on the Adriatic Sea directly to Rome. Controlling this road meant controlling the army's supply. And in Rome, whoever fed the army held power over the entire world. Even the word salary in European languages, English salary, French salaire, comes from the Latin salarium. Yes, soldiers were not always literally paid with bags of salt, but this money was issued specifically to buy it. This linguistic connection alone shows how fundamental this resource was. Romans understood salt was the blood of the empire. But while Rome used salt for expansion, others built entire civilizations on it. Look at Venice. We remember it as a city of canals, gondolas, great art, and spices. But the Venetian Republic became a superpower of the Middle Ages not because of glass or silk. It built its empire on a ruthless monopoly on salt in the Adriatic. The Venetians realized that they didn't have to mine the salt themselves. It was enough to control everyone who sold it. They forced merchants to bring salt only to their warehouses. They mercilessly destroyed the fleets of rival cities like Comacchio, simply because they dared to evaporate salt from seawater without their permission. Venice turned salt into the first global capitalist instrument. But even this instrument required blood to keep working. And yet, the true, most explosive and destructive power of salt manifested later, in France. The 14th century, the French crown introduced a tax on salt, the famous gabelle. At first, it was presented as a temporary measure, just another levy to wage war. But there is nothing more permanent than temporary taxes. Over time, the gabelle turned into an institutional nightmare and the absolute symbol of social injustice. Under Louis XIV, the Sun King, in the 17th century, the system became absurdly complex. The country was artificially divided into 6 zones with completely different prices. In salt-producing regions, it cost pennies and was barely taxed. But in the central provinces, the state artificially inflated the price dozens of times over. But that wasn't enough for the authorities. They introduced the rule of sel de devoir, duty salt. Every citizen over the age of 8 was forced to buy a fixed amount of salt annually at the inflated state price, even if they didn't need it, even if they had nothing to salt with it. You were obligated to buy it. This mandatory salt could only be used for cooking and eating at the table. If an inspector found a salted ham in a peasant's house and the peasant couldn't prove they had bought additional salt under a different quota for that purpose, they faced a trial. This was no longer economics. It wasn't even taxation. It was pure distilled coercion. And here the main paradox of power revealed itself. The tighter the state tries to pull the noose of control, the more people retreat into the shadows. Smuggling became a national profession. The people who risked their lives to transport salt across internal provincial borders were called faux sauniers, false salt makers. There were tens of thousands of them. Women hid salt in the hems of their dresses. Priests hid it in coffins. Children carried it through the woods. An entire army of tax inspectors, the gabelous, worked against them. They had the right to search houses without a warrant. They had the right to torture. People were caught, tried. For a few pounds of illegal salt, a person could be sent to the galleys for the rest of their life. Hundreds were executed every year. But the flow of contraband didn't stop for a single day, because the system broke the basic logic of human justice. Why did a person in one village pay 40 times more to survive than someone in a village 3 leagues away? Why did the king force them to buy something their family had no money for? These questions did not disappear. They accumulated for centuries. They settled in the minds of generations like gunpowder. By the end of the 18th century, France found itself in a catastrophic debt crisis. The court drowned in luxury, while the treasury was empty. Harvests were poor. Bread became expensive. Salt prices suffocated the peasantry. And in 1789, this gunpowder ignited. The French Revolution began. The gabelle wasn't the only cause, but it became the brightest, most hated symbol of how absolute power turns a vital necessity into a sadistic tool of oppression. When the furious mob stormed the Bastille and burned aristocratic castles, they were not just rising against the king and the estates. The very first thing they did was kill the gabelle collectors and burn down the tax offices. They dismantled the system where even a pinch of salt on the table had become an instrument of torture. By the way, one of the first decrees of the revolutionary government was the complete abolition of the gabelle. But the most poignant and instructive story happened later, in India. The early 20th century, the British Empire ruled India, a vast subcontinent, millions of people, boundless resources under the power of the crown. And again, the exact same ancient scheme, as if copied from the textbooks of the Chinese Han Dynasty and the French kings. The British imposed a salt tax. But now it was taken to the highest degree of cynicism. Indians were legally prohibited from producing salt themselves, strictly forbidden. Even if they lived on the shores of the Indian Ocean, even if seawater dried in the sun on its own, leaving white crystals on the rocks, you had no right to gather them. You had to buy British salt, brought from Liverpool or produced under British control, and pay a heavy tax. It didn't just look unfair, it was absurd. A resource vital for survival in a hot climate literally lay beneath the feet of millions of poor people, but the law made it inaccessible. And at that very moment, when the absurdity reached its limit, Mahatma Gandhi appeared. He understood what the British generals did not. He understood the nature of power and the nature of symbols. In March 1930, he began his famous Salt March. Gandhi left his ashram in Ahmedabad and walked to the shores of the Arabian Sea, about 240 miles along dusty Indian roads. Day by day, people joined him, first dozens, then hundreds, then tens of thousands. The press of the entire world followed this march. This was not an armed rebellion. They had no rifles. They didn't build barricades. They didn't call for bloodshed. It was an elegant, mathematically precise demonstration of the absolute weakness of the imperial system. When Gandhi reached the coast in the village of Dandi on April 6th, he performed the simplest action a human being is capable of. He bent down and picked up a handful of earth mixed with crystallized sea salt. One motion, but it shattered the entire foundation of British legitimacy. Because if the law of the empire forbade a free man from taking a little salt from the sea that washes his native land, then the problem wasn't with the man. It meant this law was criminal by its very nature. It meant this empire had no moral right to exist. Instantly, across all of India, thousands and then millions of people repeated this action. They went to the sea. They set up cauldrons in town squares and publicly evaporated salt, defying the crown. The British machine responded the only way it knew how, with repression. People were beaten en masse with clubs. They were thrown behind bars. By various estimates, over 60,000 Indians ended up in prisons within a few months. But the process could no longer be stopped with clubs. The mechanism was in motion. Salt became a powerful symbol of national awakening. It united the rich and the poor, Hindus and Muslims, higher and lower castes. And although ultimate freedom was still years away, it was the Salt March that broke the back of British rule. The empire lost its moral superiority. 17 years later, in 1947, India gained its independence. And here, if we cast a glance across the millennia, the main point becomes clear. In all these completely different stories, the exact same ironclad, inexorable mechanism repeats itself. Whether it's China in the time of Emperor Wu, ancient Rome with its legions, Venice with its galleys, France with its convicts, or the British Empire with its laws, the state chooses a resource that humanity cannot do without. It takes it under total control, and it begins to extract power, obedience, and money from this vital resource. At first, this machine works perfectly. Revenue flows into the treasury like a river. The bureaucratic apparatus expands. Armies are funded. Control tightens. Rulers feel they have found the perpetual motion machine of economics and subjugation. The system looks monolithic and invincible. But then, always, without a single exception, comes the breaking point. Because basic human needs are not charts in a minister's office. They are not just economics. They represent the physiological limit of patience. When the authorities begin to control a necessity too harshly, too greedily, and too cynically, they create with their own hands a resistance of colossal force. They compress a spring, and the harder the state's pressure, the more devastating the counterblow will be. The Chinese Empire gets invincible underground markets and uprisings. Venice gets the hatred of its neighbors and slow economic decay. The French monarchy gets a revolution, the guillotine, and the collapse of a centuries-old dynasty. The British Empire gets a national liberation movement that simply ignores its laws. The paradox of this entire historical drama lies in the fact that salt was never the main character. It possesses no magical properties. It was simply a perfect, tangible tool, a mirror reflecting the greed of rulers. The true story of salt is the story of how power seeks absolute control through things people cannot give up, and how that very control, sooner or later, becomes its main, fatal weakness. Because the state can force a person to pay taxes. It can force them to fear the army. It can force them to stay silent in the squares. But no empire in history has been able to endlessly control what a person needs simply to stay alive. As soon as power stands between a human being and their physical survival, it ceases to be power and becomes a target. And sometimes, to destroy the most powerful, heavily armed system that took centuries to build, you don't need another army. You don't need cannons and generals. It is enough for an ordinary person to walk to the sea and pick up a handful of salt.